Before we start, I want to acknowledge that Hanging Rock is on Wurundjeri country and to pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders of the past, present, and future. When I was a kid, I remember my dad telling me about the novel Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. I was sitting in the back seat of the car, probably on a trip somewhere or other. It's a true story, my dad said. There was a whole class of girls who went on an excursion to a place in the bush called Hanging Rock, but some of them went missing and were never found. What happened to them? I probably said at that point, wide-eyed and unsettled, but also morbidly curious. No one knows. A few of the girls went off by themselves, but only one came back, and she was so upset that she couldn't remember what happened. She just cried and cried, my dad explained. But something must have happened, I demanded, because, of course, there must be an explanation. No one knows, my dad insisted, but there were caves in the hills where they were going, and some of the caves were just holes in the ground that you could fall straight down into, like a rock down a well, and no one would ever find you again. Well, some people think that the girls were abducted by a UFO. My child mind chewed on this a little bit. Could that really happen? Could people just disappear like that and no one ever find out what happened? Could you fall straight down into a cave like that, like it was a black hole in the ground, drop right out of the human world and never be seen again? Despite the warm air in my family's car, I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. In fact, I even feel them right now. This was my first encounter with the story of Picnic at Hanging Rock. Now, this novel might look like something that Jane Austen might have written, judging from the cover, but I actually think it's one of the best weird stories ever written, and also one of the best Australian novels ever written as well. Even back when I was a child, just hearing this story made an impression on me that I haven't ever forgotten, and I hadn't even read the book at that point. That impression is something I probably won't ever forget. It would be nearly 20 years until I finally read the book itself, but even then, that story was powerful. I knew that there would be a mystery in the book, and I knew that there were no answers to that mystery, but it still scared the hell out of me anyway, and I just couldn't put it down. The mystery of Picnic at Hanging Rock has become almost Australian folklore. Unanswered questions surrounding the novel keep bringing it back time and time again into the minds of those who have read it. Was the book based on real events? What really happened? And if it isn't a real story, what does any of it mean anyway? I'm going to try and unravel the threads of the Hanging Rock mystery, something which has never been done to my satisfaction before in one place. Because, yes, there is an explanation to what happened. And yes, the novel was inspired by actual real events. But more important than that, this novel captures an aspect of the Australian wilderness, something that is maybe mystical, maybe sacred, but whatever it is, it's deep and dark and profound. This novel is like when you drop a rock into the dark depths of a well, and the sound echoes back up at you from the abyss. There are so many different aspects to this novel, to unpack them is going to be quite a big undertaking. So get a cup of coffee and settle in, because today we are going to be talking about the novel Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. The novel begins with an epigraph informing the reader that the events in the book might be based on true events. Whether Picnic at Hanging Rock is fact or fiction, my readers must decide for themselves. As the fateful picnic took place in the year 1900, and the characters who appear in this book are long since dead, it hardly seems important. It is St. Valentine's Day in the year 1900, and a group of schoolgirls from Appleyard College in rural Victoria, Australia, are preparing for a school excursion to Hanging Rock, a natural volcanic landform situated a few miles away from their school. At this point, we are introduced to our main characters, Miranda, who is a kind girl, universally admired and popular at the school, Sarah Wayborn, an orphan who harbors a deep affection for Miranda, and Miss McCraw, a teacher who is unwillingly accompanying the girls on the excursion. Sarah was not allowed to go on the picnic, because she was unable to recite a long and complicated poem that she was supposed to memorize for a class at the college. The rest of the college make their way on a horse-drawn buggy to the picnic ground at Hanging Rock. The picnic progresses as planned, and the only other visitors to the picnic ground are a family of English aristocrats and their coach driver. The important characters in this other group are Albert, the Australian coachman, and Michael, a young Englishman who has come to Australia to visit with his family. A group of girls at the picnic, including Miranda, Irma, Edith, and Marion, decide they'd like to head up to explore the Hanging Rock, and after getting permission from their teacher, they do so. The afternoon is sleepy, and everybody at the picnic is dozing in the shade. Some characters check their watches only to discover that their watches have stopped at 12 p.m. exactly. So the characters don't actually know what time it is while they're at the picnic. Miranda and the other girls head up to the Hanging Rock, high above the picnic ground, only to be overcome by sleepiness and lay down to rest in a clearing surrounded by rocky tors. Edith feels ill and seems to sense an impending doom and wants the other girls to return, but reluctantly stays with them. Slowly, the girls wake, and Edith notices that the other girls seem dazed. All of the girls except Edith get up and walk higher up towards the Hanging Rock. Edith begs them to stop, but they don't hear her. In one of the more eerie moments in the book, when Miranda, Marion, and Irma move up towards the rock, they don't walk naturally. They are described as sliding over the stones on their bare feet, as if they were on a drawing room carpet. Edith looks on in horror as the girls disappear behind the rocks and shrubs. Edith, apparently incredibly disturbed by this sight, runs back down towards the picnic ground, screaming. At the same time that this is happening, and as everyone else is dozing in the picnic ground, Miss McCraw gets up and begins to climb the mountain, apparently motivated by an impelling force known only to herself. The story continues back at the college, where everybody is waiting expectantly for the return of the picnic, now much overdue. The coach finally returns from the picnic, and the headmistress is informed that 3 girls and Miss McCraw are missing, and even though they searched, nobody could find them. The rest of the novel is concerned with the search for the girls and the fate of Appleyard College, which suffers from negative publicity until it eventually closes down. Edith remembers nothing of what happened up on the Hanging Rock, except that she saw a strange red cloud in the distance, and that when she was running down the hill back to the picnickers, that she also saw Miss McCraw coming up the hill. Police and search parties are brought in to find the girls and Mrs. McCraw, but no trace can be found. They have apparently disappeared into thin air. Michael, the young Englishman who was at the Hanging Rock on the day of the disappearance, is distraught by the experience and resolves to go back to the rock and try and find the girls. He does so and stays on the rock overnight to continue his search. In the morning, he is found unconscious by the coachman, Albert. However, Michael is holding a note indicating that whoever found him should look up higher on the Hanging Rock. Albert follows his instructions, and he finds Irma lying, covered in blood and dusty, high up under the tors of the Hanging Rock. After Irma recovers, we find that she has amnesia and can't remember anything of her time missing. She is surprisingly healthy for having been lost in the bush for a whole week, and quickly recovers. Michael, on the other hand, takes quite a while to recover from his experience. For the purpose of this essay, I won't dictate the rest of the plot, but basically Appleyard College closes, virtually all of the pupils being withdrawn by their parents. Miranda and the rest of the girls are never found. Sarah Wayborn, the student who was forbidden to go on the picnic, and was also possibly romantically infatuated with Miranda, commits suicide by jumping off the roof of the college, although this event is very ambiguous and she may have also been murdered. For what reasons, we don't know. Mrs. Appleyard, the headmistress of the college, now completely financially ruined by the events, also commits suicide by jumping off the hanging rock itself. I have a lot to say about this novel because the story goes so much further than just a mystery. If you're watching this video to find out what really happened to the girls in the story, then let me tell you, there is an explanation, and I'm going to summarize it now before I go into more analysis of the novel. I want to get the answer out of the way so we can talk about the really interesting and weird parts of the novel. According to Joan Lindsay's editor, Sandra Forbes, there was a chapter in the novel which explained what really happened. At the suggestion of the publisher, it was decided to excise this chapter, ultimately improving the book by leaving the events in the book a mystery. Following Joan Lindsay's death in 1984 and the success of the novel and film, John Taylor, who was Lindsay's literary agent, decided to publish the excised chapter in 1987, and the excerpt was titled The Secret of Hanging Rock. This is the book here, which you can still buy today if you'd like to, and if you're a completionist like myself and you want to know everything about Picnic at Hanging Rock, I suggest you pick it up, because the missing chapter, while only being about 5 pages in length, is very interesting. Before I reveal the contents of that chapter, I would like to point out that there is a lot of controversy about the secret of Hanging Rock. John Taylor stated that Lindsay had instructed him to publish the work after her death, but despite that, many people continued to doubt the chapter's authenticity. The chapter does seem to have a slightly different style to the rest of the book, and some of the phrases and plotting of the chapter stand out as odd compared to the rest of the novel. For this reason, some people consider it to be a fake, produced only to capitalize on the success of the novel. I don't think this assertion holds much water. This chapter is apparently a first draft that had not undergone revision. It's more likely that the editor had a hand in improving the prose of the final novel. Great works of art are often the result of collaboration, not of authorship, as some artists would like us to believe. And this is certainly the case here, since the publisher suggested removing the final chapter, ultimately making the novel into a fantastic book. I'm going to summarize that chapter now before we go any further, because to be frank, the explanation isn't very satisfying, and I don't want you to watch the whole video only to be disappointed at the end because the, quote, true ending wasn't what you expected. Then I will talk about what the novel means, why it is so important to Australian culture, and my own interpretation of the mystery. So here is the summary of Chapter 18 from Picnic at Hanging Rock. After Edith runs down the hill towards the campground, the girls continue to ascend until they come to the very top of Hanging Rock. They look down on the figures below through rosy smoke, presumably from the fires of the picnickers. They also hear a sound like far-off drums in the distance. The girls see the monolith, a particularly large egg-shaped rock which sits on top of the hill that they have climbed, and Marion feels a strong force exerting on her. She states, "The monolith, pulling, like a tide. It's just about pulling me inside out." The girls pass by the monolith and, overcome by drowsiness, fall asleep on a plateau. A lizard rests in the crook of Marion's arm, and beetles wander over Miranda's head. When the girls wake up, they are in a, quote, colorless twilight in which every detail was intensified. A brown snake slithers across the rock nearby. Suddenly, a woman in torn calico drawers stumbles into the clearing, clearly distressed. The girls do not recognize her, but they remove her corset so the woman feels more comfortable and can breathe. At the suggestion of Marion, all the girls remove the, quote, absurd garments and then playfully throw the corsets over the side of the rock where they are. The corsets do not fall, though, and instead sit in the air as though they were frozen there. The girls express wonder at this, and the stranger says that they are, quote, stuck fast in time. The stranger also states that, quote, I think we are arriving now. The girls and the woman see a, quote, hole in space form. Miranda sees the hole as painters and sculptors saw a hole, as a thing in itself, giving shape and significance to other shapes, as a presence, not as an absence, a concrete affirmation of truth. The hole in space disappears, and the girls see the brown snake that was nearby on the rock move and disappear into some foliage on the ground. The girls tear away the foliage to see an opening of some kind, possibly a cave. The woman states that she will enter first, and then the others should follow her when she signals for them to do so by tapping on the rock. The woman suddenly begins to transform, her body, quote, flattening itself and deliberately forming itself to the needs of a creature created to creep and burrow under the earth. Eventually resembling a giant crab, the woman enters the hole. Marion says that she can hardly wait to follow the woman into the rock. After they hear a tapping sound, Marion follows the woman into the opening. Then, after another tapping, Miranda follows too. Irma, distraught, sits on the ground and waits, but does not hear another tapping sound. In an emotional outburst, Irma scratches and claws with her bare hands at the rock. And that's it. That's the final chapter of Picnic at Hanging Rock. Picnic at Hanging Rock is most notable for its unresolved mystery. Everybody wants to know what really happened, after all. Not only is this the most notable feature of the novel, but it's also what makes it so great, in my opinion. Had there not been a mystery in the novel, I doubt that anybody would still be talking about this. The initial popularity of the novel was mostly due to the reader's desire to know what happened. There was even a full book published by Yvonne Rousseau in 1980 about the mystery called Murders at Hanging Rock, which combed through the story for clues and laid out various hypotheses of what could have happened. Joan Lindsay herself seemed to be somewhat frustrated by people's obsession with the mystery and their lack of appreciation of the novel as a standalone work of art. Lindsay's opinion was that the solution of the mystery was not important, and I have to strongly agree with her on that point. The final chapter, in my opinion, is superfluous and better off left out of the novel. The solution to the mystery is just not important. I will be giving my own interpretation of these events, but this is secondary to the meaning of the novel, and my interpretation of the novel changes very little when the mystery is solved in the final chapter. When I was a child, I had a few picture books, which were based on Yalanji legends and folktales. One of these stories was called Taramulli, the Giant Quincan, and featured spirits in it that were called Quincans. These spirits were mischievous beings who might trick you as much as they might help you. They were hard to see though, their thin bodies hiding behind eucalyptus trees where their large eyes could watch you when you weren't looking. As a child, when I would go bushwalking with my dad or by myself, I remember the profound eeriness that the Australian bush could have. If you've never been in the Australian bush, this is quite hard to describe. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have some of the best eyesight in the world, and there is a very good reason for this. In the bush, the trees are brown, the grass is brown, the leaf litter is brown. Everything is such a similar color that it's hard for your eyes to grasp anything. It's hard to tell how far or how close something is away from you. Your eyes just sort of slip over the landscape, and it's often easy to feel as though you're being watched or followed, especially if your head is full of stories about mischievous spirits who hide behind trees. I've been to a few countries other than Australia. I've seen Asian jungles and European forests, but in my perhaps inexperienced opinion, there is nowhere else like the Australian bush. It's like another planet. It's almost something that defies explanation, but it's profoundly eerie. That's the way I would describe it. Profoundly beautiful and profoundly eerie. The bush has an emptiness at times. you can feel surrounded by life and also completely alone. That being said, it's surprising that more weird tales haven't been set in the bush. Picnic at Hanging Rock harnesses this eeriness as the setting for disturbing and otherworldly events. The Hanging Rock itself is apparently quite a spooky place. Lindsay herself was quite impressed by the place, which she had visited in her childhood. When she first conceived of the idea of the novel, it was always centered around the Hanging Rock. When the school excursion approaches the Hanging Rock in the film version of Picnic at Hanging Rock, we get a bit of dialogue from the characters about the age of the rock. First, the cab driver says that it must be 1,000 years old, but Miss McCraw corrects him, saying that it's 1,000,000 years old and that the structures around the hill are probably about 300 million years old. She dreamily considers the rock, and one student looking up at it says,
"Waiting 1,000,000 years. Just for us."
The rock is primordial, ancient, as demonstrated by the coach driver's vast underestimate of the age of the rock. It's difficult for humans to grasp what the rock is, the forces that brought it into being, the sheer age of it, its purpose, sitting, a vast monolithic entity watching over the landscape. When the girls leave the college, presumably one of the few times that they do in their semester, they leave the prim and proper world of aristocracy and enter into the unknown wilderness of the Australian bush. This is emphasized in several ways. When Mistress Appleyard sees the girls off from the college, she permits them to take their gloves off, but only after they have passed the village which is nearby the rock. In other words, after they have passed the last point of civilization where anybody respectable might see them. As the girls get closer to the Hanging Rock itself, they shed even more clothing. First, shoes and socks as they begin to ascend to the monolith, and Mrs. McCraw takes off her skirt to proceed in only her undergarments. Finally, when they are at the summit, they remove their corsets. Corsets being both the physical and metaphorical restrictions being imposed by proper society. That's to say, the girls are going bush. The college they leave from is a very prestigious institution, as you can see here. The real-life counterpart, Clyde College, is, if it's scarcely imaginable, even more extravagant than the film version. Here, we see a college meant to embody all the regality and extravagance of English nobility. The grounds of the college are a deep green, but beyond these grounds, the countryside would immediately become deep golden brown, full of dry bush and scrub, not the verdant greenery of England. They are leaving the safety of English culture and entering Australia, an unknown and wild land. In such an exquisitely ordered world, the Hanging Rock and its sinister implications were a nightmare. In many ways, Australia is the antithesis of England. Australia is dry when England is verdant. Australia is hot when England is much colder. Australia is historically the dark side of England, a place where all the undesirable lower-class English were sent to make them disappear. As if to punctuate this point, when Michael and Albert set out for the rock in search for the girls, Michael, who is English gentry, shows his complete innocence and ignorance of the Australian bush. "I brought my flask, filled with brandy and matches. You see, I am beginning to know something about the bush." Albert gave him a fatherly grin. Michael, although good-natured and well-meaning, has absolutely no conception of how to survive in the Australian bush. The Hanging Rock itself is a particularly important symbol of this, a wild primordial land whose ancient history dwarfs even the oldest recorded English legends. Indigenous Australian culture records the vast periods of time over which the world was formed through a concept called the Dreamtime, or sometimes the dreaming. Instead of trying to explain this concept myself, because I am not Indigenous and truthfully, I'm not an expert on Indigenous culture, I will quote from the website of the Southern Aranda Family Community Group. The Dreamtime is the Aboriginal understanding of the world, of its creation, and its great stories. The dreaming world was the old time of the ancestor beings. They emerged from the earth at the time of creation. Time began in the world the moment these supernatural beings were born out of their own eternity. Dreamtime stories form a multi-dimensional view of the world. They encompass lore about the natural world and creation, about how the land was formed, stories about how mountains, rivers, and animals came into being, but that is by no means the limit of Dreamtime stories. The hanging rock, we are told, is made of volcanic stone, which evokes the vast primordial forces which created the area through which the characters travel. Forces which lay unseen, hidden below the surface of the earth, but ever moving, ever changing. This image is further heightened when the girls climb the rock and look down on the people below, comparing them to ants. Perhaps this is how the rock would view humans if it was sentient, as fleeting animals, as delicate and short-lived as mayflies. A surprising number of people are without purpose. It's probably that they are performing some necessary function unknown to themselves. Marion observes, continuing to highlight the impermanence and perhaps absurdity of humans compared to the ancient primordial rock. And earlier, on the way to the rock, Mrs. McCraw mirrors this statement by saying, humans are obsessed with the notion of perfectly useless movement. Again, our attention is drawn to the purposeless and futility of human behavior. The clocks of the various characters stop when they reach the hanging rock, perhaps indicating the uselessness of such human devices compared with the eternal dunes of time which the rock has existed through. Lindsay elaborates on her own understanding of time in an interview.
Yeah, I've been terribly interested in time, always. I always felt that it was something that was all round one, not just in a long line in a calendar. I feel it's that one's in the middle of time, and the past, present, and future is really all round, and I'm in the middle of it, which is a very unscientific way of describing it.
It is also an interesting but possibly inconsequential fact that Valentine's Day in 1900 did not fall on a Saturday, as it does in the novel. In fact, many of the dates in the novel, which are stated as occurring on particular days of the week, are actually not historically accurate. All this musing on the purpose of individuals and the nature of time puts us in a mindset that views reality from an observational perspective. We are viewing what is happening at the rock from an almost cosmic scale, not from the humdrum perspective of everyday life. Quoting again from the Southern Arante family community group, during the creation of our world, the ancestors moved across a barren land, hunting, camping, fighting, and loving, and in doing so shaped a featureless landscape. Moving from dreams to actions, the ancestors made the ants, the emus, the crows, the possums, the wallabies, the kangaroos, the lizard, the goanna, the snakes, and all of the food and plants. They made the sun, the moon, and the planets. They made the humans, tribes, and clans. Each could transform into the other. A plant could become an animal, a landform, a man or woman. To me, this seems as though the Dreamtime is a world where intention and physical manifestation become one. When considering the rock as a sacred place, as a place of power, what does it mean when considering the desires of the girls? The desire to live a carefree existence, apart from useless and purposeless actions, and perhaps free from the normal time and the scheduling it imposes. As if to highlight this point, at the particular moment when the girls are ascending the rock, Sarah Wayborn is back at the college memorizing an absurdly long poem. This is the life that awaits them back at the college. As the girls ascend the rock, they seem to become more carefree. Marion, in particular, starts to dance. The narrator observes that such abandoned folly would always be beyond Edith and her kind. Perhaps it's more than just coincidence that Edith becomes scared and runs back towards the normal human world, while the other girls ascend towards the wilderness at the top of Hanging Rock. The Dreamtime is never mentioned directly in the novel. In fact, neither is religion, apart from St. Valentine's Day. But this is not to say that the concept of the Dreamtime wasn't known to Lindsay or an influence on the story. The Dreamtime is known to virtually all Australians, and Indigenous culture cannot help but be an influence even on those Australians who are not Indigenous or who don't know much about Indigenous culture. In the story, we see the Hanging Rock as a kind of mystical primordial symbol, and it's not hard to associate this with Indigenous culture, since Indigenous people are, after all, the original inhabitants of the continent of Australia, living there for tens of thousands of years before any cultures from Europe or elsewhere made contact. In addition to this, we must also consider the concept of a totem in Indigenous culture. A totem is an important concept in Aboriginal culture. Places of significance are where ancestors entered the earth, at which time they died, but their spirits remained. These places were also marked by natural objects. When a woman conceives, it simply means that one of these spirits has gone inside her. The child, when born, is regarded as the reincarnation of one of the spirit ancestors associated with that spot, and therefore it belongs to that particular totemic group. I believe this is the meaning behind the constant appearance of animals in the chapters of Picnic at Hanging Rock, which take place around the Hanging Rock itself. The girls have come to a place of ancient power and are connecting to the animals from which their spirits came. In my opinion, the girls have entered into the Dreamtime, or something like it. Their intention was to leave the world of mortal futility behind, and in this place of power, the Hanging Rock, they transcend back into their spirit forms, or perhaps their totems, into an ageless non-existence where human suffering and concerns don't exist. In the film, when Michael returns to the rock, he sees a lizard before he finds Irma, and in the novel, when Albert finds Irma later, there is a lizard sleeping with her on the rock. In the missing chapter, a lizard is also sleeping in the crook of Marion's arm, as if the animal has a connection to her. In addition, in the novel, we see imagery of bronze beetles tied to Miranda, and in the film, this is replaced with the imagery of a swan, but it's essentially the same idea. An animal comes to represent a person. In the deleted chapter of Picnic at Hanging Rock, when the girls disappear and enter into the rock itself, it is a snake which leads them through the hole that they enter. And Mrs. McCraw literally transforms into a crab, which we can assume is possibly her totem. In the film version of Picnic at Hanging Rock, we see Michael sitting in his garden, where he enters into a kind of dreaming state and sees a swan in a pond nearby, which proceeds to fly away, a sign that Miranda has left this world and is not coming back. Of all the girls who go missing, Irma is supposed to be the most altruistic. We are told this about her in the novel. Irma Leopold had wanted above all things to see everybody happy. Sometimes it almost became an unbearable longing. My theory is that Irma returns because she sees the suffering that her absence causes, and instead of existing in the spirit world, she desires to return and assuage the pain that her disappearance has caused. But by passing between the spirit world and the normal world, she loses her memory of what happened. In the Lost chapter, Mrs. McCraw states that everything in the universe has its appointed position. And also in the Lost chapter, Irma is not signaled to enter into the hole in the rock, which I take to mean that she does not belong in the place which Mrs. McCraw, Miranda, and Marion has gone. Instead, she belongs in the human world. And perhaps this is for the best, because we are told that Irma goes on to use her family's immense wealth for all sort of charitable and altruistic purposes, thus improving the world. This is my interpretation of what was really happening behind the events in the story of Picnic at Hanging Rock. But this is certainly not all that is going on in the story. There are many different themes that are being expressed in this novel, and I'm going to go into some more of them now. One of the aspects of Picnic at Hanging Rock that is particularly mystifying is the undercurrent of homoeroticism in the novel. This is something that when I first read the novel, I barely noticed, other than in one or two scenes. But the more you look, the more it pops up. The novel begins on Valentine's Day, and the girls are excited to be receiving Valentine's cards. Except it's an all-girls college, so there are no young men around to give these girls cards. So instead, we see the girls send cards to each other. Lindsay writes that all kinds of love were present in this situation, which we can take to mean that familial, companionate, and romantic love were all present. In addition to this, we see imagery persist as the girls are climbing the rock. The French teacher remarks that Miranda looks like an angel with more than a little admiration. When the girls are climbing the rock, Edith brings up that Sarah Wayborn writes poetry and that she even wrote a love poem to Miranda.
You must learn to love someone else apart from me, Sarah. I won't be here much longer.
As the girls climb the rock just before they disappear, they begin to take off their shoes and stockings, which shocks Edith. Edith also states, bashfully, that when she saw Mrs. McCraw climbing the rock, she didn't have a skirt on, just her underclothes. When Irma is found and her clothes are accounted for, we receive some conversation from the maids saying that her corset was not with her when she returned. Finally, in the deleted chapter of the novel, when the girls are at the summit of the hanging rock, they take off their corsets and throw them off the cliff. They are literally liberated from the confines of decency. So we have a lot of imagery around the girls taking off their clothes together, and it's on Valentine's Day, a day all about love and expressing love, especially romantic love. While maybe that doesn't prove anything, there are a lot of hints here. The homoerotic imagery is not limited to the women in the novel, though. In fact, I first noticed this homoeroticism between Albert and Michael. Michael, who is a prim and proper young Englishman, is fascinated by Albert and his life, asking about his tattoos and sharing beer with him. Albert and Michael become unlikely friends, very friendly, in fact. In one scene, when Michael visits Albert, Albert is sitting naked on his bed while the two talk, and this doesn't seem to bother either of them. In addition to this, after Michael and Albert find Irma on the rock, there is a brief courtship between Michael and Irma. The two seem perfectly matched, both wealthy young gentry brought together by dramatic circumstances. Except the romance never materializes. Even though they spend time together, they just aren't interested in each other, at least not romantically. At the end of the novel, Albert finishes working for Michael's family and moves on to find work, and Michael suggests that the two of them should meet up again in Queensland. Now, what should we make of that? It seems that Michael isn't going to chase after Irma, but perhaps Albert. It's certainly no evidence that they are lovers, but there is more than a hint of homoeroticism in the course of their friendship. At the end of the novel, Sarah Wayborn commits suicide by jumping off the roof of the college. This is probably because of the bullying behavior of Mistress Appleyard towards her and the fact that she will have to go back to an orphanage once the college closes down. But in the film especially, it is also implied that it is because she is heartbroken at Miranda's disappearance. The novel was published in 1967, a time period notable for the increased sexual freedom enjoyed by women compared to the more conservative expectations of the past and of Lindsay's childhood. At the time, Lindsay was in her early 70s, so she would have hardly been in the middle of the cultural movement. But I also think it was part of the zeitgeist of the time, and Lindsay was definitely part of the intelligentsia. So she likely would have been keyed into this movement even before it was mainstream, perhaps even when she was younger. According to a biography of Joan Lindsay called Beyond the Rock by Janelle McCulloch, Joan Lindsay apparently had various intense friendships with women. at least one before her marriage and one after she had become emotionally distant from her husband later in life. The book, Beyond the Rock, hints that perhaps these were more than intense friendships and may have crossed over into romantic territory, although it's really impossible to say for sure. Regardless of its possible real-life inspiration, I think that the idea of homosexuality, or at least bisexuality, was one of Lindsay's themes which she was trying to portray in the novel. I will come back to why this is important in the next section, but first I want to explain a little bit more about what makes this novel so great and so impactful. As humans, we create paradigms which we use to process the world. We form ideas about how things are, yet for all our striving, these are only roadmaps. They are not the location itself. And when we are confronted with something that doesn't fit our roadmap, we are forced to redraw it to fit the new evidence. Weird fiction is a kind of literary genre which attempts to provoke just such a reaction from its readers. Weird fiction attempts to confront the reader with a world that is beyond their idea of how the world should be. In weird fiction, characters often encounter hideous monsters, alien gods, inexplicable events or experiences, but in short, they are often left with knowledge that scars them. The realization of the enormity of reality and how small their own understanding of that reality is terrifies them. An experience of something weird is like a catalyst that forces them to confront their assumptions and ideas about reality. They suddenly realize that things are not as they appear, and there is a kind of existential panic which sets in. It's like suddenly realizing you're in a boat in the ocean, and there is a whole world of things underneath the surface that you don't know about. In the novel Picnic at Hanging Rock, I believe this is the purpose of the mystery. The Hanging Rock is a place where reality begins to break down. It's an experience of weirdness. An example of this is when the girls are climbing the rock. They pass the same place twice. On page 34, we read, "They found themselves on an almost circular platform enclosed by rocks and boulders." Then, on page 38, we read again, "The semicircular shelf on which they presently came out had much the same conformation as the one lower down, ringed with boulders." Not only is this weirdness represented by abnormal geography, we see the clouds are also acting bizarrely, and a sound like drums begins to echo from the distance. It is also represented by all of the clocks of the various characters stopping at exactly 12 p.m. The place they have entered is almost like it's outside of time. It defies measurement and comprehension through ordinary means. It forces the reader to reconsider their understanding of reality and hypothesize about what unusual events might have spirited the girls away. The girls in the novel disappear, but the results of their disappearance affect everything. The characters who remain must grapple with their own emotions and their unresolved need to know what happened. The reader taking a bird's-eye view of the events since the picnic will have noticed how various individuals on its outer circumference have somehow become involved in the spreading pattern, all of whose lives have already been disrupted, sometimes violently. Coming into contact with the unknown forces people to reflect, and this is the purpose and reason for the events in the novel. We are asked to reflect on how we think reality works, how time functions, but also how human relationships function. This, I think, is the reason for the homosexual themes in the novel. It's to make us question how perception of human love. If our roadmaps of physics and the natural world could be wrong, couldn't our roadmaps of human emotion also be wrong? For the time period when this novel is set, homosexual relationships might have been just as unthinkable as disappearing into thin air. In short, it was inconceivable. And yet, the novel is asking us to consider the inconceivable at every step of the way. We are asked to believe that people could just disappear into thin air with no reason or explanation. We are also, but more subtly, asked to consider if love between two people of the same gender is possible. By today's standards, this isn't too crazy of an idea, but consider that Joan Lindsay was born in 1897. And as she was growing up, her conceptions of relationships would have been based on the societal expectations of the time. At that point in history, it was inconceivable that two people of the same gender could simply fall in love. Lindsay, according to Janelle McCulloch, was perhaps bisexual. Let's consider how Lindsay might have felt growing up as a young woman in the early 20th century and possibly feeling romantic feelings towards other women, probably just as in awe, confused, or even terrified as the audience feels reading about the girls who go missing on Hanging Rock. For Lindsay, I think the numerous feelings and themes which are in Picnic at Hanging Rock are all intertwined. Sexuality, mathematics, mysticism, and mystery are all mixed up in a big pot of emotion, and in this book, they all come spilling out in the story. The point of the mystery is to try to make us conceive of all the possibilities in the world that we have never considered, and it all leads the reader to the same maddening place, an unanswerable question. Why do bad things happen? Humans have asked themselves this question over and over throughout history. While there are many responses to the question, the very fact that it continues to be asked shows that there is no satisfactory answer that can explain everything away. In The Picnic at Hanging Rock, the characters also continued to ask themselves what happened on the rock and why did it happen. The servants gossip about it, the newspapers speculate, the townspeople have theories, but nobody knows, not even Edith or Irma, the only two survivors of the event. In a scene towards the end of the novel and film, we see Irma return, briefly, to Appleyard College. She interrupts a dance class, and the teacher tells the class that Irma is about to leave with her family to go to Europe, and they have a few minutes to speak to her before she goes. The other students don't crowd around her wishing her farewell or inquiring about her health, as you might expect. Instead, Irma is met with a suspicious silence. The girls are waiting, expectantly, for her to say something. In the film, this scene is expertly framed as we see the girls lined up on either side of the room and Irma in the middle in a red dress. She looks as if she's on trial for something. Suddenly, an attack of hysteria overtakes the girls, and they swarm Irma, screaming at her to tell them what happened. The teacher, terrified by what she's seeing, huddles behind her chair, unwilling to stop what's happening. Everybody suddenly becomes incredibly upset. In many ways, this mirrors the desire of the reader. We just want to grab Irma or Edith and shake her and yell, "What happened?" But there is no answer, Irma doesn't know, and we never find out. Like I said before, people make their own mental paradigms of the world, and when something doesn't fit into that paradigm, it's upsetting. It's as if you were walking through your house one day and suddenly you see an extra door in the hallway, one that wasn't there before. How would that make you feel? People can't stand mysteries. Mysteries need to be solved. There has to be a logical explanation for everything, somewhere, somehow. In Picnic at Hanging Rock, we are given a jigsaw puzzle with a whole bunch of pieces, except they don't fit together, and they're not meant to fit together. So we just go around and around trying to figure out how to make them fit so our nice, neat model of the world can be intact again. This, I believe, is purposefully done. We have thrown bizarre little details that seem important in some way but turn out to be meaningless, such as the red cloud which Edith sees, which some readers have speculated could be a UFO which abducted the girls. Although I think that this red cloud is more of a red herring, to be honest. These details are all decoys. The incongruent facts are expertly placed on purpose. In real life, when there isn't an explanation, it throws people into an existential crisis, even provoking a crisis of faith if they are religious. We see this happen to the characters in the novel when the girls attack Irma, demanding to know what happened. The college itself is basically torn apart by the events at Hanging Rock. The event is like a black spot that people just want to forget about. They want to cover it up and not think about it. When we examine a work of fiction, it's often tempting to see the author as an all-knowing, omnipotent creator who has everything figured out. In reality, I think authors are closer to the reader than we might think. It's entirely possible that Joan Lindsay did not really have a rational explanation for what happened to the girls when she wrote the novel. Whether she did or didn't, 70% of the novel is concerned with the aftermath of the picnic. We don't even really get to know the girls long enough to care too much that they are missing. As the reader, we mostly want to figure out the mystery. The purpose of the novel, therefore, is mostly to show how the mystery affects other people in the society around it. How an event like this can set off a chain reaction that can end in the most unlikely places, such as with Sarah Wayborn's suicide.
It was like dropping a stone into the water. I felt that story, if you call it a story, that the thing that happened on St. Valentine's Day went on spreading out and out and out in circles from that first thing that happened. And it went on, and it affected so many lives and so many people and so many generations ahead and before and after. But anyway, I'm getting a bit complicated.
Think about how we ourselves handle this event. Do we try and rationalize what has happened? Find an explanation? Do we obsess over it? Do we deny it? Call it a conspiracy? When people are confronted with such events in real life, they can act in a variety of ways, such as with anger, hopelessness, or even denial, and we see all these reactions from the characters in the novel. The fact that the girls who do return don't remember anything is a huge clue as to the nature of the mystery. It's just blocked out. It's like it's something that is just too big to grasp, and so it's left untouched. Because, after all, most people have everyday concerns. The laundry needs to be done, the garbage needs to be taken out. We just don't have time for these big questions. Picnic at Hanging Rock is all about what's not said, as shown in the excised chapter 18 of the novel when the girls encounter the hole in space, which is basically the original climax of the novel. It wasn't a hole in the rocks, nor a hole in the ground. It was a hole in space. She saw it as painters and sculptors saw a hole, as a thing in itself, absence, a concrete affirmation of truth. This is what the themes in Picnic at Hanging Rock are like. Sexuality is not mentioned, but it's on everybody's mind.
I say the crude things. You just think them.
Colonialism is not mentioned, but it's undeniably there. The Dreamtime is not mentioned, but its animal totems wander in and out of every scene. Much like how the maids refuse to discuss the missing undergarments of Irma, the book refuses to come out and say what it's about, and that is why it's such a compelling read. I've learned through my research of this book, the layers just keep going and going. The more you peel it back, the more there is underneath. You can almost never get to the heart of it. Okay, so now we have the various themes of the book laid out. I would like to talk about some of the real inspirations behind the novel, some of which are real events, places, and people. I'm taking most of my information from a book called Beyond the Rock by Janelle McCulloch. This book is basically a biography of Joan Lindsay, but also details a lot of the historical facts behind the novel. It's really a fantastic read, so if you're interested in the inspirations behind the book in more depth, I highly suggest that you pick it up and read it. According to Lindsay, some of her earliest memories were a trip to Hanging Rock when she was only 4 years old. Her family spent the summer of 1900 at nearby Mount Macedon, and Lindsay recalls that this was the first time that she saw Hanging Rock. So Hanging Rock was a deeply embedded memory in Lindsay's life. Appleyard College, the college that the girls go to, did not exist in real life. However, there was for a time an upper-class girls' college located near the rock, a place called Clyde College. Not only that, but Lindsay actually attended this college from 1911 till 1914. This college was originally located in East St Kilda in Melbourne, which was where Lindsay attended the college, and it was not until 1919 that the college was moved to Mount Macedon and into the close vicinity of the Hanging Rock, which was only 6 kilometers away by road and even closer if one was to cut through the paddocks directly. So Lindsay did go to this college, but not while it was located near the Hanging Rock. By this time, Lindsay was 22 years old and was living in Melbourne. However, this history of Clyde College is leading somewhere very interesting. Clyde College had a school magazine called The Cluthan. This magazine reports a very intriguing account of an excursion to the Hanging Rock by several students in 1919. Apparently, the rock is known to cause strange atmospheric phenomena to occur, being the only elevated geographical landform in a relatively flat landscape. The rock often caused clouds to form around it. The Camera Club from Clyde College convinced the head mistress, Mrs. Henderson, to allow them to take an excursion to the Hanging Rock in order to take photos. This is what the school magazine, The Cluthan, has to say about the event. On Saturday, November the 8th, the fields between Clyde and the Rock were the scene of much merriment as a long line of girls wended its way round or over or through marshy hollows and weed-covered streams. On arriving at the foot of the rock at sunset, we found it too dark to take daylight photographs, and when we mounted to the summit, the moon through her film of misty clouds, though very beautiful, afforded insufficient light for successful moonlight photography. Joan Lindsay evidently still received issues of her old school magazine, and thus came into contact with the account of the nighttime excursion of the students of Clyde College to the Hanging Rock. This is confirmed by one important detail. This real-life picnic, just like the one in the novel, was led by a teacher named Miss McCraw. So this is undeniably an influence on the writing of Picnic at Hanging Rock. While we are on the subject of Miss McCraw, some of the other characters in the novel are also based on real-life people. These include Marion, who is one of the girls who disappears on the rock, Mr. Hussey, the driver who drives the carriage to the rock for the picnic, and also Dr. Mackenzie, who attends to Irma after her rescue from the rock. Marion is based on Marion Wanless, who lived from 1896 until 1984, and Marion Wanless was actually one of Joan Lindsay's friends at Clyde College. By the way, an interesting bit of trivia is that at the start of Picnic at Hanging Rock, Joan Lindsay states that while the events may be based on true events, all the people who are featured in the novel have passed away. This is a funny little bit of misdirection because Marion Wanless was definitely still alive when Picnic at Hanging Rock was published. But let's get back to the characters who are based on real-life people. Mr. Hussey's name is probably taken from the Hussey Brothers Grocery and Drapery, a store which existed in Woodend, a town close to the Hanging Rock, for many years. And finally, Dr. Mackenzie was probably based on Dr. J.H. Mackenzie, who treated patients in the nearby area of the Hanging Rock between 1900 and 1902. In addition to all of this, once the school was relocated to the vicinity of Hanging Rock, the rock became the subject of ghost stories and rumors. One of the rumors was that several local girls had gone missing on the rock sometime in the 1800s. Naturally, these stories would have been a delight to tell the new students upon their commencement at the college. Joan Lindsay not only spent numerous occasions in her childhood around the Hanging Rock, but also many occasions in her adult life as well. So I think it's very likely that she may have heard these ghost stories and rumors from her time spent around the rock. I believe that this is the real inspiration behind Picnic at Hanging Rock. These supposedly true stories of girls who went missing around this strange geographical landform in the vague past. Janelle McCulloch, in her book, Beyond the Rock, briefly details her own search for the origin of these ghost stories. There are many cases of missing people, some of which are women who disappeared from the areas located roughly around the Hanging Rock. And according to McCulloch, there is one case which does match the description of the ghost stories told about the Hanging Rock. Apparently, 2 girls went missing on the rock sometime between 1850 and 1900 and were never found. Janelle McCulloch reports that this is basically all there is to say, and that out of respect to the descendants of these people, she has decided not to publish any further details. Although, if you did want to go to the Library Council of Victoria and sort through 50 years worth of microfilm, then you could probably find the exact missing persons case that the ghost stories were based on. One day, I would actually really like to do this and discover the facts of the case that Picnic at Hanging Rock was based on. But I suspect that, likely as not, there isn't much information about these events. Final thoughts. Even though I've just spent nearly an hour talking about this book, I've really only touched on some of the themes which could be drawn out of the book. For instance, there's a lot that could be said about how this book reflects on colonialism in Australia and how the colonial population fits into the Australian land. But the purpose of this video is to talk about the most prominent part of the novel, the mystery, the aspect of the novel that makes it unforgettable, that makes the novel stick in your teeth, and makes you want to tear your hair out with frustration. The parts I couldn't stop thinking about when I first heard about the story all those years ago in the back of my parents' car. And in this respect, I hope I've shed some light on the mystery of Picnic at Hanging Rock. Hi everyone. I hope you guys find the book Picnic at Hanging Rock just as fascinating as I do. If you like this video, then go ahead and subscribe below, because there'll be more videos like this coming soon. You can also follow me on Twitter if you like, where I often share little tidbits of things I discover, like artwork or good books I've been reading. Thanks for watching.